The rope wasn't hemp. It was a cheaper, coarser twine that bit into the skin long before the weight of the body did. Saskia Lowe didn't look at the crowd. She looked at the mud of the Thames, watching the tide creep toward her boots. In London, they didn't give pirates the mercy of a long drop. There was no sudden snap of the neck, just the Marshal's dance, a slow, rhythmic twitch of the legs as the lungs turned to stone. But to understand how a woman like Saskia ended up at execution dock, we have to go back to a humid afternoon in the Caribbean 3 months earlier. The deck of the Oosterhout merchant was slick, not with blood, but with something far more dangerous to the British Crown: ink. As the naval boarding party climbed the rails, Saskia didn't reach for her cutlass. She reached for a heavy wooden crate belonging to Kensington Partners. While the sailors around her surrendered, she heaved the crate, filled with the private trade ledgers of the governor of Jamaica, into the black water. That wasn't just piracy. It was the systematic deletion of the empire's secret wealth. And the empire does not forgive a deleted database. When the trial began in Spanish Town, the heat in the courtroom was a physical weight. Justice Sterling Vane didn't look like a man of law. He looked like a man who had lost a fortune. He methodically polished his spectacles with a silk handkerchief, his jaw so tight the muscle pulsed. He didn't see a criminal. He saw an unnatural glitch in the social order. The room smelled of stale tobacco and unwashed wool. There were no juries here, just Vane and his ledgers. Beside Saskia stood Jory Thorne, a man she'd fought alongside for years. Jory was shaking, his eyes darting to the windows. Saskia stood perfectly still, her hands shackled behind her, her thumb tracing a jagged scar on her wrist. When the verdict of death by hanging was read, Jory collapsed into a sob. Saskia didn't flinch. She turned to him, her voice a dry rasp that carried to the back of the room. If you'd fought like a man, you wouldn't have to die like a dog. But then came the gamble, the only card a woman had left to play in a world that owned her body. Saskia stepped forward, her voice steady as she uttered 3 words: "I plead my belly." The courtroom went silent. This wasn't a request for mercy. It was a legal stalemate. Under English law, the Crown could not execute an unborn child for the crimes of the mother. But the verification of this plea wasn't a doctor's visit. It was a humiliation. Saskia was taken to a back room where the matrons of the court, a group of local women hardened by the colony, were tasked with a manual examination. There were no pillows, no privacy, just cold wooden tables and the suspicious eyes of women who saw her as a monster. If you want to see if Saskia survives the next hour, you need to subscribe right now. Because the truth of what happened in those cells is darker than any ghost story you've heard. Join the few who actually know how this ends. Subscribe. The matrons confirmed it. Saskia was pregnant. Her execution was stayed, but her mercy was a different kind of hell. While the men were paraded to the gallows in a cart, jeered at by crowds throwing rotted fruit, Saskia was moved to the hulks. These were decommissioned warships, like the Vanguard Maritime, stripped of their masts and left to rot in the harbor. They weren't prisons. They were floating coffins. Inside, the condensation dripped from the ceiling like a slow leak, mixing with the filth on the floor. There was no light. The air tasted of salt and dysentery. Saskia spent her days in the dark, her back against the weeping timber of the ship's hull. She watched the other women, those who hadn't been famous enough for a trial. Women like Mian Vosen, who had been caught on a smuggling sloop near Virginia. Mian didn't get a trial. She didn't get to plead her belly. Mian was taken to the docks of Williamsburg and tied to a post. The cat o' nine tails didn't just bruise. The knotted cords were designed to hook into the skin and pull. By the 20th lash, the cobblestones were stained a deep, permanent rust. The crowd didn't cheer. They watched in a heavy, suffocating silence. This wasn't justice. It was a branding. For the women of African or indigenous descent found on those ships, the end was even quieter. They weren't even afforded the dignity of a noose. They were processed as spoils of war by firms like Northwood Logistics. Their names were scratched out of the pirate manifests and entered into a different kind of ledger, the kind that tracked property, not people. They disappeared into the kitchens and cane fields of the interior, their histories erased as if they had never held a sword. Back on the prison ship, the fever finally took Saskia's cellmate. There was no burial, just a weighted shroud and a splash in the night. History remembers the names Anne Bonny and Mary Red because they were theatrical. But for every Anne, there were 100 Saskias, women who didn't die in a blaze of glory, but in the slow, damp silence of a rotting ship. They were reduced from legends to lessons, sacrificed to ensure the ledgers of the empire remained balanced. Their stories don't end with a final word. They end with an absence, a gap in the record where a name used to be. As the Roman historian Tacitus once wrote, "The more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws." And in the 18th century, the law was a rope, and the rope was always waiting for the tide.